Hello friends, the top 10 best books on the topic of tithing. For people who want to really understand the biblical arguments, I would recommend the following resources, and the good news is that they are all free. If you read these books, you will have a broad, very solid grasp of the topic. The best books on tithing were written from about 1870 to about 1930, 1940. In my opinion, generally speaking, there are no good books after 1940. Because these books are all old, they are in the public domain. So they can be found at archive.org, HathiTrust, Google Books, and other online archives. I'll provide links down below. Let's start with number 1. An excellent book is Christ Our Creditor, How Much Owest Thou? Or The Tithe Teramuth, Its Philosophy, History, and Perpetuity by N.L. Rigby. That title is really long, apparently published several times from 1895 to 1912. This is a very rare book found mostly in special collections in research universities or seminaries. Several years ago, I was very fortunate to obtain an actual physical copy of the book, which has been scanned and is now available online. It was very difficult to find his actual name, but eventually learned it is Nicholas Lyndon Rigby, born in England around 1840, who later moved to the USA. He was a Baptist minister who appears to have spent the last years of his life in the Los Angeles area. If anyone can find a date of death or where he was buried, please let me know. Number 2 is an essay found in the book Gold in the Gospel, which was first published way back in 1853. Now, this is interesting because in the early 1850s in England, rewards were offered for the best essays on stewardship and Christian giving. Over 50 manuscripts were submitted by people of various denominations, but only the best 5 were rewarded and published in this book, Gold and the Gospel. All of these essays are worth reading and studying, but in my opinion, the most helpful essay for defending the 10th is titled On the Measure of Christian Liberality by Henry Constable. These are definitely not your typical sermons that we hear today in the pulpit. This was a generation not distracted by social media and constant stimulation. No, these people back then, they put a lot of time and effort and thought into their arguments. Compared to what we hear today, this is heavy-duty, very serious stuff. By the way, this was in England, but this was also happening in America. As you can see here, rewards of up to $300 were offered for the best tract on systematic beneficence. Those best essays were published in this book here in 1856. Today we use the term stewardship, but in the early 19th century, the most common terms were systematic beneficence or systematic benevolence. And yes, $300 for the 1850s was a huge amount of money. Book number 3 is What We Owe from a Lawyer's Standpoint, written by J.P. Hobson in 1900. John Peyton Hobson was a judge for the Court of Appeals in Kentucky who happened to be a very big advocate for tithing. His book is relatively short, just 54 pages, but very well argued, and it's interesting to read because as a judge, his perspective would be different than someone who, say, works for the church. On page 38, he asks a great question. If the matter is doubtful in deciding our own case, shall we not solve the doubt in his favor? In other words, if we know that we must give, but we are not sure of the standard, why don't you err on this side in the Lord's favor, in favor of the unreached, in favor of the unevangelized? So great thoughts. Recommended book number 4 is The Tithe by Reverend E.B. Stewart, or Elmer Bryan Stewart, published in 1903. The introduction was written by the layman, which, if you know the history, is Thomas Kane of Chicago. Number 5 is a doctoral dissertation titled The Scriptural Tithe, which is arguably the most serious scholarly defense of tithing published in the last 100 years. Dr. William Walker Barndollar published a 370-page dissertation for a Doctor of Theology degree from Grace Theological Seminary in May of 1959. Recently, I contacted and requested Grace Seminary to make this public, so they finally published his dissertation online for anyone to read. The only problem is that their copy has duplicate pages. See the links down below. Dr. Barndollar's contribution to the study of tithe are the strong arguments arguments and research for Genesis 26:5, 1 Corinthians 9:13-14, and Hebrews 7:8. Genesis 26:5 is a really interesting verse. The weakness of his paper is, in my opinion, is the poor exegesis of Hebrews 7:6, and he makes some confusing statements about the relationship between law and grace. However, overall, it's an excellent must-have resource. I did make a longer video on Barndoller's paper going through that, so see that video to learn more. Book number 6 is The Gospel Self-Supporting by Reverend Alex Hogshead, published in 1873. He does a lot of great work developing the arguments from Abraham and Melchizedek. Now, I don't think I personally could go through life with that last name, Hogshead. That would be tough, but anyways, good material. Book number 7 is the 2-volume work Sacred Tenth by Henry Lansdale of England, published in 1906. This is arguably one of the most influential books ever published on tithing. Dr. Croteau said that Dr. Lansdale advocated tithing from a more scholarly basis. Lansdale's work was a landmark in tithing research because not only was it the culmination of the previous 3 decades of research, but it became paradigmatic for tithing arguments and discussions over the next 99 years. This was later published in 1908 in an abbreviated version titled The Tithe in Scripture. This man was ordained as a priest in the Church of England, and if you search his name online, you'll find some very interesting pictures of him because he traveled on a yak through Central Asia, region of China and Russia, where he distributed Bibles and religious literature. He wrote several books about his travels and experiences. Anyone who dresses up with what looks like chainmail and an axe is probably a really interesting person, and his book does not disappoint. Book number 8 is The Law of the Tithe and of the Free Will Offering by Reverend A.W. Miller, also published 1873. It's kind of long. I felt the first half of the book has some helpful points, but the rest of the book wasn't really that helpful. He has long citations and footnotes written in Latin, so if you need help going to sleep, you might try to read those. And by the way, just because I recommend a book doesn't mean that I endorse every single thing they say. Some of these authors make excellent, great points, while sometimes will present weak arguments. For example, sometimes it's common for people, especially in that era, to go too far and try to make the argument for tithing from the story of Cain and Abel, but that is very weak, and you should avoid that. Recommended book number 9 is an essay, Divine Right to Tithes, by Charles Leslie, originally published around 1700. The context is that in the early 1600s, a book had been published by John Selden about a controversy of tithes and who should collect it and who had authority, the government or the church. That history is complicated and is beyond the scope of this video. Anyways, Charles Leslie responds and actually provides very good, insightful arguments for tithing. And finally, number 10, God's Twin Laws by John G. Alber, a short tract published around 1916. There are different versions, but most of them are only about 16 to 18 pages, so short and easy to read. In 1936, Alber was in a debate that later was published as a book, which was recently scanned and made available online, as you can see here. Parts of the book are really funny because he zeroes in on the weakness and asks, is Christianity retrogressive? Does Christ demand less than Moses? Does the gospel sound a retreat? Has Christianity lowered the standard of liberality? May a Christian, if he feels like it, give less for the whole world than the Jew gave for Palestine? Is it right for a Christian to be more selfish than a Jew? Can a Christian do less under the law of love than the Jew under a loveless law? Does cold duty call forth greater sacrifice under the law than gratitude under the gospel? Is Sinai stronger than Calvary? People who oppose tithing really don't like questions like these, and they are notorious for doing whatever they can to avoid them, as I've demonstrated in previous videos. It's true today, and it was true back in 1936. People who oppose tithing, they want to say that we are compelled by love and not by the law. But if that's true and we can now give less, then by definition, Jesus is making people more selfish. By definition, the cross of Christ leads us backward, not forward. For people who oppose tithing, the number one premise of their argument is that Jesus died so that we can keep more of our money. But they don't want to state that directly because it sounds so bad. and so they don't like these types of questions. Now, this author, Albert, he sees this. He sees the weakness, and he responds and says, hey, look, he makes no attempt to answer the grand array of questions. I will leave it to the reader that there is a good reason. I challenge him to attempt it. If you go to this book and search the word array, you'll find some very funny comments. So those are the top 10 that I would recommend. There are, of course, many more books out there from the same time period that are very similar. You will also notice that many sermons and messages that we hear today about tithing and stewardship are very thin and shallow compared to what was preached 100 years ago. Once you read these books, you will notice the significant difference in quality. It's very interesting to read these books, which were written long before what we know today as mega churches and the prosperity gospel. These authors lived in a very different generation. If you are interested in the history of how the stewardship revival began in the 1800s and later kind of morphed into the emphasis on tithing, you will want to read George Salstrand's book, The Story of Stewardship. Finally, here are some additional resources worthy of mention: a compilation of Thomas Caine's pamphlets. Caine was the biggest and most well-known promoter of tithing, but he never wrote a book. He published tracts and pamphlets by the millions, and thankfully, many of these have been scanned and archived online. Here's some trivia for you. The first denomination in American history to officially accept tithing was the Seventh-day Adventist Church in October of 1878. There were individual churches that would later accept tithing, but as far as official acceptance by an actual denomination, that would be the Seventh-day Adventists, and they actually published two books which are decent: The Tithing System by George Butler and The Honor Due to God by E.J. Wagner. Another really interesting book, non-denominational, is titled The Path of Wealth, or Lights from My Forge, published in 1888. So there's a blacksmith in his shop working at his forge and anvil, and some farmers show up needing some work done, and they start talking about religious topics, and this blacksmith has really interesting thoughts about giving and tithing and prosperity, and it turns out that what he said was so interesting that more and more people from town start coming to this guy's shop to hear him talk about tithing, and eventually there were so many people wanting to listen that they had to change locations to accommodate the larger crowd. So very interesting book about the relationship between tithing and prosperity. If you are a serious student of the topic, you will somehow want to get a hold of a thesis in the Biola University Library near Los Angeles titled The Christian and the Practice of Tithing, a Theological Study by B. Scott Williams. He does not support tithing, but he makes a lot of really good observations about the weakness of arguments against tithing. A very helpful resource. So if you are in the LA area, you can just visit the library and use their Wi-Fi to access the document. Many of the books and resources mentioned in this video have been largely unknown or difficult to access, but because so many libraries are digitizing their archives, a lot of this material has recently become available. So we today really have a wealth of material available to us that was not available 15 to 20 years ago. One last example, a rare journal devoted specifically to the topic of tithing was first published in 1918, titled The Tither. There are only a few known extant copies, and they were located in a rare book collection at a university. So when I learned about this, I contacted them, and thankfully the staff there recently scanned and uploaded all the available copies of this journal to the Internet Archive. So that's really interesting, very cool if you want to check that out. So those are my top 10 and additional recommended resources. If you study those books, you will have a solid, unbreakable defense for biblical tithing. Thanks for watching, and as always, have a nice day.